I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The room was prepared for a private family discussion, not an announcement that would redraw the emotional map of the monarchy. But Prince William did not hesitate. With Charlotte only feet away and senior relatives waiting for an explanation, he confirmed that his daughter would stand as the sole heir to Diana's private fortune. The words were simple. Their meaning was explosive. And almost immediately, faces around the room began to change. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William kept his attention on Charlotte because he knew the decision would land hardest on her. The prince had formally confirmed that she alone would inherit Diana's private fortune, leaving George, Louis, Harry, and every other possible family beneficiary outside this specific inheritance. A private estate, in plain language, meant wealth and possessions owned personally rather than assets belonging to the crown. That distinction mattered because Diana's legacy included investments, inherited wealth, jewelry rights, keepsakes, and personal holdings whose meaning went far beyond their financial value. This was not about handing Charlotte part of the monarchy. It was about placing one deeply personal inheritance into her hands. Charlotte had entered the room expecting another serious family discussion, nothing more. Then she heard her own name and stiffened. Her eyes moved immediately toward William, searching his face for some sign that she had misunderstood. She had not. The young princess suddenly realized that the conversation was no longer happening around her. It was happening because of her. Catherine noticed the change before anyone else. She kept watching her daughter instead of the adults, already sensing that the greatest emotional burden might fall on the youngest person present. Charles said nothing. The king remained motionless as the meaning settled over him, and his silence only made the tension heavier. Harry reacted differently. His expression tightened as he understood that Diana's private legacy had been assigned to one grandchild alone. He looked toward William, then toward Charlotte, and the hurt in his face was impossible to miss. The monarch was confronting the past. Diana's younger son was confronting exclusion. And the girl at the center of it all was still trying to understand why she had been chosen. William finally reached for the sealed folder beside him and placed it firmly on the table. The prince explained that Charlotte's position was not ceremonial, symbolic, or merely an expression of preference. The arrangements had already been established through Diana's estate, meaning the private legal structure controlling her personal assets had been organized around this single future beneficiary. He then set his pen beside the folder, looked directly at his daughter, and told her that what Diana had protected privately would one day belong to her alone. Harry could no longer remain silent. He leaned forward and asked the question everyone else had avoided. Why only Charlotte? William did not answer. Not yet. He would not explain why George had been passed over, why Louis had been excluded, or why Harry himself had apparently been given no role in the final decision. That silence was enough to expose something deeper. This had not been decided because Charlotte was simply loved or favored. Something had happened before this meeting. Something had convinced William that Diana's private legacy needed one guardian and one guardian only. Catherine watched him closely because she knew that silence. It was the expression he wore when memory and duty collided. Charlotte noticed it too, and for the first time, she began to understand that the fortune she had just inherited was carrying a history no document could explain. But before anyone could understand why Charlotte had been chosen, they first had to confront what Diana represented to each member of that room, and why her legacy had never belonged equally to all of them. Charlotte had inherited no memories of Diana. She had never heard her grandmother laugh across a dinner table or watched her walk through Kensington Palace. Yet suddenly, she had been handed something more complicated than money. Responsibility for a woman whose absence had shaped her father's entire life. William could see the confusion on his daughter's face, and for perhaps the first time, He understood how heavily Diana's unfinished story might now rest upon Charlotte. William found Charlotte alone after the meeting and sat beside her without opening the folder. The prince understood that Diana's private estate was not merely wealth. It was the personal money, keepsakes, jewelry rights, and belongings she owned outside the crown, meaning outside the institution and property of the monarchy itself. That mattered deeply. These were not ceremonial assets. They were fragments of a mother he had lost, protected from the machinery governing nearly everything else in his life. Charlotte looked at him and asked the question he had feared. "Did Granny choose me?" William looked away before answering. He told her that she had been chosen for a reason, but not as she imagined. Unlike George, whose future remained tied directly to the crown and the duties of a future sovereign, she stood close enough to understand its burden without being destined to rule. That position, he believed, could protect Diana's private legacy from becoming absorbed into something colder. Catherine confronted William later, her concern sharper than anger. She warned him that Charlotte must never believe she had gained something by taking it from George or Louis. He agreed immediately, yet his pause exposed a history he still refused to explain. Catherine knew that hesitation meant the decision had begun long before the announcement, and she pressed him to tell their daughter the truth, before silence turned inheritance into guilt. George had sensed part of it. In a conversation months earlier, he heard his father speak about keeping Diana's personal legacy separate from future royal structures. The young prince had not understood the full meaning then, but now the fragments aligned. Harry, however, saw something harsher. To him, excluding his branch of the family felt like another boundary drawn between Diana's two sons, another decision made after years of distance and mistrust. William finally told Catherine that the answer rested in a remark Diana once made about daughters, privacy, and inheritance. A documented family account had preserved the words through someone who heard them firsthand. He would not repeat them yet, and the explanation would lead them back years, to one private royal gathering, one uncomfortable exchange, and the moment William decided Diana's legacy could no longer be left vulnerable. Every family fracture has a moment people remember differently. In this story, it began during a private memorial gathering at Kensington Palace, when a conversation about Diana's belongings became something much more dangerous. William had entered expecting remembrance. Instead, he heard arguments about ownership, future access, and whether certain possessions should eventually return to broader royal control. By the end of that evening, one thing had changed permanently. William no longer trusted Diana's legacy to remain untouched. William had watched the pressure build for years, and that night made it personal. Diana's private estate meant possessions and wealth she owned separately from the crown, while dynastic collections were objects preserved for the royal family across generations. That distinction mattered, because George's future would carry institutional responsibilities. The prince feared that anything passing through his eldest son could become tangled with duties, palace management, and public display rather than remain unmistakably Diana's. Camilla changed the temperature of the room during the Kensington Memorial Dinner. The Queen Consort suggested that important pieces connected to Diana might eventually be placed under centralized royal control and displayed as part of the monarchy's story. William pushed his chair back immediately. He told her that his mother's most personal belongings would never become instruments of palace management. Catherine watched him as anger gave way to something more painful. The discussion had stopped being about objects. For him, it had become about whether Diana could still be taken from him in another form. Princess Anne approached William later, away from the others, and spoke. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, reminded him of an old conversation, preserved in a documented family account. Diana, she said, had once spoken about keeping certain personal possessions within the female line, rather than allowing them to disappear into institutional collections. Anne repeated the memory, and William understood why it mattered. Charlotte became more than a possibility. She stood outside George's direct path toward the throne, yet close enough to royal life to understand the responsibility attached to Diana's name. William began to see her as the one person who could inherit the private legacy, without automatically folding it into the future sovereign's institutional world. Catherine understood the logic, but she understood the danger. William closed the study door after the dinner, placed both hands on the desk, and looked at Catherine. "This stops with me," he said. She asked whether Harry would be told. The prince hesitated, then decided the arrangements had to be secured first. Years later, that promise would return to the center of the family. And when Harry finally learned what William had done, restraint disappeared almost instantly. Forever. Harry had spent years believing that whatever remained privately connected to Diana belonged emotionally to both brothers. Then William announced that Charlotte alone would inherit the fortune. No consultation, no shared decision, no warning. When the two men finally faced each other privately, years of resentment rushed into the room with them. This was no longer a disagreement over wealth. It was about whose memory of Diana carried authority, and whether one brother had just claimed the final word. Harry stepped toward the table before William could soften the moment. He saw Diana as the unbreakable bond between them, something neither distance nor duty could erase. William understood that pain, but he refused to surrender the principle behind his decision. The prince insisted that Diana's private estate, her personally owned wealth and possessions, separate from crown property, had to be protected from institutional disputes. To him, preserving one clear line of inheritance was not ownership of memory. It was defense. Harry's voice hardened. "You had no right to decide what Mum would have wanted for everyone." William stayed seated and answered. "Doing nothing," he said, "would have left Diana's belongings vulnerable to competing claims, palace pressures, and arguments over access." Harry accused him of shutting him out and turning another family matter into a closed decision. His brother fired back that privacy had become impossible, once every disagreement threatened to widen beyond the room. William finally gave him the missing piece. A documented family account preserved by Princess Anne contained notes from an earlier conversation about Diana wanting certain personal assets to remain private rather than drift into institutional control. Anne had kept that record because the distinction mattered. Private property belonged to the individual or chosen heirs, while institutional property served the monarchy itself. William told Harry that those notes did not name Charlotte, but they shaped the logic that led to her. Harry demanded to know why George and Louis had been excluded. William answered. George's future relationship with the crown could blur the boundary between Diana's private legacy and royal responsibility. Louis, he explained, had been excluded because splitting custodianship would invite the very fragmentation he was trying to prevent. Charlotte had been selected as one designated guardian, not as a favorite. Harry remained unconvinced. He moved closer, and William slid the inheritance summary across the table. "Read every line," the prince told him. Harry looked down at the document, then back at his brother. The anger had not disappeared, but now it had somewhere specific to go. The argument could expose the pain behind the decision, but only the documents could reveal who actually held the power to make Charlotte Diana's sole heir. The family had treated William's announcement as an emotional decree. It was far more carefully constructed than that. Behind Charlotte's name stood years of private planning, trustees, inheritance clauses, and decisions designed to separate Diana's personal fortune from the crown itself. But paperwork alone could not explain the choice. At the center of the arrangement remained one person who had carried Diana's memory for decades, and whose quiet intervention had helped William make his final move. Princess Anne sat opposite William and studied him before speaking. The arrangement, she reminded him, depended on private estate planning rather than royal succession. In simple terms, royal succession decides who inherits the throne, while a private estate controls personal wealth, belongings, investments, and possessions outside the crown. That difference gave the prince room to protect Diana's fortune separately from the institution he would one day lead. Anne asked whether he truly understood what Charlotte might face once the decision became public. He did. Protecting Diana's legacy, William answered, also meant protecting the girl chosen to carry it. Charles read the inheritance structure twice before lifting his eyes. The king was not angry with Charlotte, but the force of Diana's presence still unsettled him decades later. The documents showed that one beneficiary would control the private collection, preventing jewelry, investment holdings, correspondence, and family keepsakes from being split into competing branches. Charles removed his glasses, placed the papers carefully on the table, and said only, "So this was decided long before today." His words carried no accusation, but William heard the weight behind them. William then pointed to the clause that made everything possible. A private provision, meaning a legally written condition inside the estate arrangement, gave him authority to confirm the final beneficiary while Charlotte remained young. That was why his announcement had sounded so absolute. It was not a sudden preference made in anger. It was the final step in a structure built to keep Diana's personal legacy from becoming palace property. The protected collection included jewelry, correspondence, investments, and intimate keepsakes never meant to drift into routine institutional use. Charlotte's position, therefore, changed more than the future. It changed access in the present. William ordered that the private collection be treated under the new custodial structure immediately, and Anne understood what that meant before anyone said it aloud. Some names would lose automatic access. Some requests would now require approval. Charles looked toward the papers again, knowing the decision was about to become real in a way no family discussion could contain. And once that decision became active, the first consequences arrived not through another announcement, but through a locked door and a name suddenly removed from an access list. Until that morning, Diana's private legacy had existed largely as memory and paperwork. Then the palace began enforcing William's decision. Access codes changed. Inventories were reassigned. Private custodians received new instructions. Suddenly, the announcement had physical consequences. And nowhere was that more obvious than when Camilla arrived expecting access to a historical collection connected to Diana, only to discover that the authority had shifted. The queen consort stopped at the doorway, heard the explanation, and realized Charlotte's inheritance had already changed palace protocol. Camilla had expected a routine review connected to a proposed historical exhibition. Instead, she was told that several Diana-related pieces could no longer be released without William's documented approval. A private custodian, in plain language, is the person responsible for protecting and controlling access to personally owned items rather than crown property. That distinction now mattered more than ever. Charlotte's position as sole heir did not simply promise future ownership. It created a protective boundary around possessions that had previously been treated as available for commemorations, displays, or family requests. Camilla paused at the archive doorway for several seconds. She asked whether the restriction applied to her specifically, and the answer was colder than she expected. It applied to everyone without authorization. The queen consort did not argue. She turned away without entering, but the humiliation followed her down the corridor. The decision had moved beyond William's words. It had become protocol, and protocol could close doors even to someone at the center of royal life. Charlotte saw the tension later, and immediately blamed herself. She asked Catherine whether people were angry because Diana's inheritance now belonged to her. Her mother answered without hesitation. The Princess of Wales told her that adult disagreements were not hers to carry, and she repeated, That inheritance did not make Charlotte responsible for anyone else's disappointment. Still, the girl could feel the change around her. She had gained protection, but that protection was creating distance. William reacted firmly when he learned about the access request. The prince ordered that no privately held Diana item be moved, photographed, displayed, or transferred without written authorization. Harry, after reviewing the inheritance structure himself, unexpectedly stopped challenging Charlotte's position directly. He remained angry with William, but his anger was beginning to shift away from his niece and toward the process that had excluded him. Charlotte noticed that change. Instead of allowing the adults to continue speaking around one another, she asked William for something he had not expected: a private conversation with Harry. The prince resisted at first. Then he saw that his daughter was no longer asking about money. She was asking about pain. The adults had spent days arguing over what Diana left behind. Charlotte was about to force them to confront something else entirely, what Diana might have wanted them to become. There were no aides in the room. No lawyers. No folders. No advisors waiting outside with carefully prepared language. There was only Charlotte, and the uncle who believed part of his mother had been taken away from him. The princess had heard enough arguments about money, inheritance, and control. She wanted to understand the pain beneath them. And when Harry finally sat opposite her, the confrontation everyone feared became something entirely different. A child asking an adult why Diana's memory was causing so much hurt. Charlotte had begun to understand that inheritance could give someone responsibility without giving them answers. She knew the fortune would one day be hers, but she did not yet understand the emotional cost surrounding it. Harry accepted the private meeting despite his anger toward William because his niece had done nothing to create the dispute. He refused to let her become collateral damage, meaning someone harmed by a conflict they did not cause. That distinction mattered to him. Whatever he felt toward his brother, he could not place that burden on Charlotte. Charlotte asked the question directly. Did Harry believe Diana's private inheritance should have belonged to him instead? He hesitated. Then, in a recorded private conversation preserved for the family, he admitted that the deepest wound was never about money. It was about being excluded from another decision involving his mother. Harry told her that each time something connected to Diana was decided without him, it felt as though another piece of that bond had been closed behind a door. Charlotte listened without defending William. Then she said something that changed the entire conversation. She did not want possessing Diana's belongings to mean possessing Diana herself. Harry fell quiet. The simplicity of the thought cut through years of arguments about control, access, and inheritance. His niece was not claiming ownership over a grandmother she had never known. She was trying to understand how to protect a legacy without turning it into a weapon. Charlotte made him a promise. When she was old enough to control the collection herself, Diana's private objects would never be used to erase Harry's connection to his mother or divide the family. He studied her for a moment, then made his own decision. He would not challenge her position. Whatever remained unresolved between him and William would stay between the brothers. William learned about the conversation afterward and was stunned by what Charlotte had accomplished. The prince had spent years building legal protections around Diana's legacy, yet his daughter had done something paperwork never could. She had changed its emotional meaning. Before leaving, Harry squeezed Charlotte's hand and said, "Look after what mattered to her." She answered quietly, "I will." That private promise would soon become public knowledge, and outside the palace gates, Diana's name would once again bring Britain to a standstill. By morning, the inheritance decision was no longer a private royal drama. Charlotte's name dominated broadcasts, newspaper covers, and conversations far beyond palace walls. Yet the public response surprised the family. The story was not framed simply as a young princess receiving enormous wealth. It became a debate about Diana, memory, motherhood, and whether Charlotte now represented something strangely powerful, a direct emotional bridge between a grandmother Britain had never forgotten and a granddaughter who had never known her. William watched the reaction with growing unease. Broadcasters focused on the contrast between George, whose future remained connected directly to the throne, and Charlotte, who now carried responsibility for Diana's private legacy outside the line of succession. The line of succession simply means the legal order determining who may inherit the crown. Palace officials stressed that Charlotte's inheritance did not alter that order. She had received private family wealth, not constitutional power. And that distinction mattered because public fascination was beginning to turn a personal decision into something much larger. William heard one phrase repeated across the coverage: Diana's keeper. The prince lowered the remote and looked toward Catherine. This was supposed to protect her, not turn her into a symbol. She understood his fear immediately. The Princess of Wales reminded him that Charlotte's private conversation with Harry had already shown unusual clarity. Their daughter understood what adults around her had repeatedly forgotten. Inheriting someone's possessions did not mean owning their memory. Outside Kensington Palace, public emotion gathered around one simple gesture. People left flowers near the gates, connected so deeply with Diana's memory, and among them appeared two photographs placed side by side. One of Diana as a young woman, another of Charlotte from a recent royal appearance. Beneath them sat a handwritten card carrying 4 words that spread rapidly through coverage of the moment. 1 legacy, 2 generations. William saw the image repeated on television, and Catherine saw how deeply it affected him. Harry then faced the question everyone expected him to avoid. During a brief recorded exchange with reporters, he refused to criticize Charlotte or challenge her inheritance. Instead, he said Diana's memory should bring her grandchildren together, rather than divide them. His restraint mattered, because it removed the most dangerous possibility still hanging over the family, that the dispute between 2 brothers could become a public battle involving the next generation. Charlotte heard what Harry had said and understood the significance. William did too. The prince realized that the family finally had a chance to end the conflict without defeating anyone. The public had already decided what Charlotte represented. Now the family had to decide whether they could finally accept the inheritance without allowing Diana's legacy to divide them again. The final meeting began without ceremony. No announcement was planned. No palace statement waited outside. William had already made the legal decision. Harry had already confronted him, and Charlotte had already changed the emotional course of the dispute. What remained was harder: acceptance. Diana's private fortune had exposed old wounds between brothers, unsettled Charles, challenged Camilla's assumptions, and placed extraordinary responsibility upon a young princess. Now the family had to decide whether the inheritance would remain a symbol of division or become something better. William spoke first. Charlotte would remain the sole heir to Diana's protected private fortune. There would be no reversal, no division, and no redistribution. The inheritance would stay protected while she grew older, with the prince overseeing it until she was ready to assume full responsibility. That meant he would act as custodian, the person legally responsible for safeguarding the assets, until his daughter could manage them herself. Harry listened without interrupting, but William knew one wound still demanded an answer. The prince told his brother that he did not regret protecting their mother's estate. Yet he did regret allowing the arrangement to become final before Harry understood it. That exclusion, he admitted, had deepened pain that was already there. Harry answered quietly. The inheritance itself had hurt less than being left outside another decision involving Diana. Still, he would not turn Charlotte into the battlefield for that grievance. Charles then looked toward his granddaughter. The king had struggled with the force of Diana's memory, but his voice was steady now. He told Charlotte that inherited objects mattered less than what she chose to preserve through them. The monarch's blessing removed the final uncertainty hanging over the family. Catherine watched her daughter absorb those words, and the princess understood that the burden was changing into something quieter, responsibility with purpose. Charlotte spoke for herself. She said Diana's private collection should remain family history, never trophies, political symbols, or weapons in future arguments. William heard the answer and knew why he had trusted her. Harry accepted it. Charles accepted it. Catherine supported it. The decision no longer felt like a victory over George, Louis, or anyone else. It felt like a boundary drawn around something fragile. William placed the sealed inheritance folder into Charlotte's hands. She did not open it. She held it against her chest, looked first at her father, then at Harry, and understood the final verdict. Diana's fortune would belong to one granddaughter, but her memory would remain larger than any inheritance. Charlotte inherited the fortune. Diana remained theirs together. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.